So previously, I talked about the Gen 1 Pokemon and how they help in team building, and today I am back to do it with Gold, Silver, and Crystal, or at least Generation 2. Now, when it comes to what we want to talk about, I realized that having 5 tiers isn't as expansive as I wanted. For Gen 1, it wasn't as bad, but as we get to talking about the bigger generations, not necessarily Gen 2, it starts to become a little harder. So I did add a tier in between replaceable and interesting, where it's noticeable but it's not very prominent. It's not going to be your go-to in any one regard, but it does have something that's special in. I think it's the nice concession I put. Not usable, of course, is now still the lowest tier, and we have a lot more of those in this generation. So Gold, Silver, and Crystal, what I introduced is one about 100 Pokemon. A lot of them are very unusable, as we'll talk about the actual team building aspect. But at the same time, it added some move pool changes, which is really cool. Elemental punches are available by TM, which increases a lot of viability for different Pokemon. Return is now a very prominent TM that is learned by most of these Pokemon, meaning most Pokemon have access to a normal move. Whether it's great or not is entirely up to debate, but ignoring that, it's still something to be happy about. Also, on the same note, special is now split into special attack and special defense. I know a lot of people are like, oh my god, just shut up about changes. We know this already. But some people honestly don't know, meaning that a Articuno is not necessarily a special tank anymore, just because it's high special. It is in this case, but for example, Alakazam used to have a insane special, wherever Alakazam is at, because this is split up like an actual... I don't even know, but Alakazam used to be considered one of the best special tanks, not only because of recover, but because its special stat was super, super high, meaning it could tank the special attacks as well as deliver them out, which is something that was changed, and fairly so, and now we get stuck with a lot of different Pokemon. This is organized, like, dumbly. I don't know what the thought process is here, but it's very frustrating. But we also have to talk about Gold, Silver, and Crystal's in-game thing before we start talking about any Pokemon. I'm going to try and go starters and then do the birds and then the bugs, and we'll see what shapes up. But we have not 8 gyms, but 16 gyms. And I'm just going to be brutally honest. If you are unavailable before the first 8 gyms, or even right before the Elite Four, it's pretty much you're unusable. And let me tell you, there's a lot, and a lot of them are new Pokemon, which is really troublesome. But let's get into the starters. We've been sitting here for too long already. This is where stuff has changed. It really sucks because of the way Pokemon is. Starters are supposed to be this very vibrant and important choice. Johto is way different. Chicory is replaceable. Totodile is a little different. It's noticeable, and of course you have Cyndaquil, which is actually just interesting. It's not super special, but because the elemental punches, Totodile and Cyndaquil have a little bit of a mainstay. Specifically, Totodile is able to come up into noticeable, gets access to Ice Punch, it gets Bite, which is now Dark, thank you, and it gets access to Surf in general really, really early. It's one of those Pokemon that is actually one of the few water types that can actually hit with a water type move early. It's really weird to say because there are some Pokemon we'll talk about, specifically like Tentacool, that could, but it doesn't learn Bubble Beam until way later, and it becomes kind of a more cumbersome than an actual usable Pokemon. But Cyndaquil is the interesting one. It's probably going to be the top of this tier, and maybe as I go along, we'll change this up for super special. But when it comes to Cyndaquil, it gets access to its fire moves and generic normal moves, just like example Charmander. Dig is off the table this time. Not that it can't learn it, but Dig is only 60 power. It's not that valuable. But the difference is once you get to Typhlosion pretty late into your first 8 badges, usually around 7 or 8, you will get access to Thunder Punch, which brings a whole different variety into your normal play. Something very important to note is Flamethrower is learned relatively late, meaning you're stuck with Flame Wheel. It's something to be honest about, but also at the same time, fire Pokemon are not that prominent, so it gets a very special thing. So let's go into... I want to talk about the birds. I think the birds are very interesting. We have 3 birds to talk about. We have Hoot Hoot, which I do think is kind of noticeable. I am gonna have to find Pidgey here. There we are. I knew you were around. Again, Pidgey's moved up in the world, surprisingly. And then we have here's Firo. Here's Spiro. What is this organization? Whatever. And Spiro, which is interesting. Uh, it's kind of funny that they laid out this way, but the three birds in this department are they appear really early. You can catch all of these in the first like three routes. One of them involves the nighttime mechanic, which is noticeable, but it's also one of those things where Pidgey has kind of evolved from being just really mid to being just okay. It does okay in every department. It has access to return just like the other Pokemon, and while it does do it better than Hoot Hoot, it is more along the lines of it's just type changes has really affected it, like Gust actually being a flying move, access to tackle right away being different. Overall, it's just it gets access to moves that matter, Twister, so on and so forth. It's not a great Pokemon, but it is more relevant than it was last time. Who is different. It gets access to Hypnosis. We've talked about this, and it gets access to a bunch of weird kind of TMs throughout the game that makes it noticeable. It's not going to win any rewards if you go all the way into level 20 with it and you don't drop it. Noctowl is actually an incredible special tank. It's kind of surprising to a lot of people, and it's actually one of my favorite Pokemon. Just get off topic for a second, to use in Heart Gold Soul Silver, because Air Slash is just a very fun move once that is introduced. But you're going to be stuck with not great flying moves. Mostly you're just going to be using Peck and then eventually Fly. It's not good, but it is noticeable for being a sleeper and decent speed, so fine. And Spearow is here because unlike the first game where Spearow kind of falls apart and it has a better option in the form of Doduo around the 4th gym, this doesn't really fall apart hard because Return is much more viable as a use. Drill Peck is actually a very rare move that does not appear that often. And at the same time, it just does a little better in everything because of the lower level cap in the first 8 gyms. I will say it does struggle in the latter half of the game by a huge margin. And by the time you are at the final boss, it only really has a couple matchups that actually matter. But for the most part, in the early game, you're up against just a flying type train or gym leader, Bug into normal, which rollout kind of shits on it, but so do all of these at this point. And then you go into Ghost, but then you go into fighting, and yeah, you do get walled by Steel, but that's just the way it is. And Ice is probably going to win, but it does have a great matchup against even like the Dragons, and the Elite Four is not bad either. Yes, it isn't great, but you have just the Psychic type user, which for most of those Psychic types you can kind of punish with a fast physical attacker. It's not going to always work out, but it's fine. And then you go into like say Koga, which Koga has a couple bug types that are incredibly weak, and it also hits neutrally against Fortress. It's not going to do a lot of damage, but it's something noticeable. And at the same time, it can hit some of the weaker fighting types that Bruno happens to carry. It doesn't really do well against the other stuff, but that's more along the lines of just being weak by that point. It's not going to be a fantastic Pokemon, but it does decent. I also do want to point out it actually gets kind of trashed by the rival. Yes, it does good against the Golbat line and the Haunter into Cadaver, so on and so forth, but Magnemite exists, which is a big problem, and that's also why Firo is not actually above Cyndaquil here, which is why Cyndaquil is actually here, because Steel types exist now. Something to be note of. We'll talk about Steel types as we go farther and farther. Next, we have the bugs. The bugs have inherently differed as we've gone along. We just have the mid brigade. Let me grab the Beedrill, Kakuna, where's Weedle? Okay, Spinarak is here. We just have the bug brigade, which all go in mid, sadly. They don't do anything. Where the hell is... Okay, am I just missing it? Weedle. There's Metapod. I'm snowblind at this point. I want to talk about the normal types after. Yanma can be talked about later. It's a swarm Pokemon, which we'll talk about swarm Pokemon specifically because they're really annoying. Where is Weedle at? Okay, Weedle is around here. I'll try and find him, but I think I'm just missing him. Kakuna, Beedrill. Weedle's not here. Go up. Yellow. I'm looking for Yellow. Where the hell is Yellow? Not to. What the fuck? Anyway, ignoring this, all the bugs have the same problem in this generation, being that the bug type still doesn't have a great stab. Fury Cutter is not good, and they happen to be even weaker than they were before because the special split into special attack and special defense affected main entries such as Caterpie, which had a decent showing, and at the same time, the other bug types are really not available, which there's Weedle. I found it. I don't know how I missed that. But this is possibly the order I would kind of put these in. I do think Beedrill happens to be the worst case. It does have an interesting little tidbit where its Twin Needle is the only move that can poison steel types. Do with that what you will. But ignoring that, Ladybug is a defensive on the special side that doesn't do any attack. It's supposed to be a support Pokemon. Doesn't get a lot of support moves. Spinarak overall is just not well put together. It's not a great physical attacker in Caterpie. While it still has the special offerings and the powders, it falls apart pretty hard. Bug types get punished along with grass types in this game, and it just doesn't really get a good showcasing, which really sucks because I do think Caterpie could have had the chance. But ignoring that, we go to the normal types that you have available. You, of course, have Rattata. I happen to think that it's moved up a bit. A lot of this has to be in part due to Sentret, who doesn't get out of anything. And there should be another normal type somewhere I want to talk about. Or am I forgetting that it comes later? I'm forgetting. It'll go in my mind eventually, I'm sure. But when it comes down to it, Sentret just happens to not be that usable. It does get a quick evolution and a decent attack in return. It does get some noticeable like TMs that I think are fine, but Rattata in general and to Eradicate, while its return is going to be the same, it just happens to be faster and hits a little harder, so it's a little more not as bad. I do think Sentret just gets kind of nuked as time goes on. And now I think we're at the part where I'm going to have a hard time like thinking of Pokemon. Here's Crobat. Where the hell is Zubat? I don't know. But like, I mean, not usable. I'm just going to start moving not usables as we get along here. But when it comes down to a lot of these Pokemon as well, I'm going to ignore a lot of the version exclusives because they just don't necessarily work out. But where the hell is Marie? There's Marie. But we'll talk about Marie because it's a little bit later, but it does appear in Gold and Silver, not Crystal. And I happen to think this is probably the most interesting Pokemon we'll talk about. As we'll look at this list here, electric types are actually very, very rare. Some of them are a little more prominent as you go along. Some of them are possibles, namely in Crystal. And if you look at certain Pokemon, you can get them using rare chances as like the Odd Egg for Crystal in this case. But if you look at it, you're locked to not that many electric options. And in fact, as I kind of sit here, I don't really see a good electric answer. So it's probably super special. Probably low though. It doesn't get access to Fire Punch. You know what? I'm actually going to put it up there. Now that I give Ampharos more credit, definitely important. But this is specifically for Gold Silver, which, sorry about that. I think my dog was coughing or something. That was weird. But which I do think is actually a pretty important thing, is that Gold and Silver, it's an incredible Pokemon. But of course Crystal is not available. Sorry, I got really distracted there. I'm trying to find Zubat. Where's Zubat? Nobody knows where Zubat. Where's also Geodude? It's actually important this time. Oh, here it is. Geodude actually gets the super special case of being one of the best early game. In fact, super good early game, to the point where it's one of the best Pokemon you can have. If it was based on the first 4 gyms, Geodude would be one of the strongest, if not the strongest, contenders for S rank just in game tiers. But the problem is it doesn't really get off to a great running as you get along. Yes, it does okay against Chuck specifically, because Poirath for some reason just doesn't do the right things, but it still is fighting versus rock ground, so not great. It does decent against the steel types, specifically Magnemite, and Steelix doesn't have a great answer, but against, say, in this case, the dragons, it doesn't do amazing, specifically Kingdra, and it doesn't do amazing against Price, who kind of can do Icy Wind and win. And as you kind of go along, it does have decent matchups even as a Graveler, but it doesn't get access to the Earthquake Rock Slide combo that was prominent in Gen 1, kind of lowering it down into the bottom of Super Special. It's very unique in that it's one of the few, and I do mean few, Pokemon that actually get something interesting early on that can just kind of bulldoze, but it doesn't get much after. It's very, very lackluster. And in fact, I'm kind of tempted to lower down interesting. We'll see how I feel as we go along. We get access to Togepi pretty early. I also forgot. Yeah, but Togepi actually is just very replaceable. A flying normal type. Interesting. It involves friendship. This Pokemon is actually very bad. It has a little bit more special attacking and does get access to some cool TM moves, some utility, but it's at that point go Noctowl if you want a tanky flying type. Yeah, at least Noctowl can do Hypnosis. But yeah. Next we go. I'm forgetting the name of this. Jumpluff, Skiploom, Hoppip. There we go. Sorry. I think it is actually a very interesting Pokemon, but it just kind of gets relegated to this. Like the flying grass type, but it's bad. It also doesn't do any good grass type maneuvers. It doesn't do any good flying. If this had been a normal type, nobody would have noticed. Like nobody would have noticed. I think we're going to talk about Wooper, which is actually a really cool Pokemon and very interesting. A lot of this has to do with, funnily enough, can learn Ice Punch, but it evolves incredibly early, is a Water Ground, which is the first time this has come up. Water Ground is an incredible typing, and even though Quagsire is not the strongest Pokemon, it still can hit a lot of super effective damage that it kind of succeeds. The only problem is that it's kind of slow, which is a big problem in Johto, but it's still very, very interesting. And in fact, part of me wants to put it up here because it actually just does great throughout the entire run, and you get it quite early. Sunkern, I'm waiting for that. Am I not? Is there anything else? I don't know where Zubat is at. It has to be like down here, right? Ekans is relatively early. We could talk about that. You can get this in... I don't think you can get this in gold. Or maybe it's flipped. I don't remember. Ekans, I think, actually gets a little bit more use in this game. Last time I gave it a pretty bad score in general because it got acid. That's why I got acid and glare. This one, it gets a lot more use in random TMs, such as it can actually use Bite, which is a dark move, which is cool, but it also gets access to Dig relatively early, which, while being the nerf Dig, is still a very interesting thing. Acid is much more prominent. You can get access to Sludge Bomb as a TM, meaning it actually can use a decent poison move. Poison types are still not that great in Gold, Silver, and Crystal in general, but they have a lot more to go. They kind of get trashed by a lot of the bosses in the game, but they still do a lot more than they did, which is, much more promising. And we'll talk about coffee as we go. And I want to talk about these, but Dunsparce is part of this. I actually think Dunsparce is actually quite noticeable because it does get access to Glare and is a tanky beast. I talked about it last time with Wigglytuff specifically, but a lot of the Health Sponge Pokemon are not necessarily available early on, though we will talk about Jigglypuff and how that changed. But Dunsparce is here and is strong for its point. You get access to Headbutt right after the second gym. You get access to Rollout in this case if you really want to. It doesn't have a great TM compatibility range, but at Glare you can do some Rest Talk scenarios. It's overall a pretty decent Health Sponge, which is the first one I have marked as a Health Sponge here. Next we go into this is just so I hate so many Pokemon. If there was a list with just first forms, and you'd think there would be, but no, it's all like Little Cup garbage. Ghastly's relatively early. We could talk about this now. A lot of people would be like, hey, Ghastly's very good. And you're right. If you can evolve into Gengar, it is definitely super special. One, it's the only ghost type. But two, this isn't a Gengar. This is a Haunter. And this is it. In fact, I'd probably argue, can you not do that? I'd probably argue here. Because if you look at the Ghastly to Haunter to Gengar, which Gengar is not available, for some whack-ass reason in Gen 2, Haunter does not get Ice Punch. Does not get Thunder Punch. Does not get any of those. Which means you are stuck with Thunder as your special option, which is in the casino, which is really late. And not really late, but is pretty late. And while the ghost typing is incredible for Gold, Silver, and Crystal. I actually think it's better than in Kanto, or in Red and Blue. It is still kind of neutered by the fact that, one, a lot more Pokemon get access to Mud Slap just in their level up move pool. Random ground moves such as Magnitude. There's a few other ones that are prominent that I can't think of, but like you're kind of hit more for super effectives. There's no Levitate in this generation, which would have been special. And at the same time, while its move pool has been increased with Shadow Ball actually being relevant, it doesn't use Shadow Ball to great extents. Yes, it is still decent because stab is very, very important, but it's still not as good as you would want. If only a Haunter could learn Ice Punch. Wonder why that occurred. But let me talk about... We'll talk about you in a second. You can get Poliwag quite early in Crystal, but it's set a little bit later. And I'm going to be the brutal one here. I think this Pokemon's actually pretty good. Even as a Poliwhirl, if you're locked into Poliwhirl, I think this is one of the better water types you can get access to. And we're going to start a nice noticeable water type trend. But when it comes down to it, Poliwhirl still has its amazing moveset. And it gets access to Ice Punch. So, hip hip hooray. You get access to Surf, Ice Punch, Body Slam. You could do some Belly Drum shenanigans. Hypnosis. Like, this is a great Pokemon. Even just as a Poliwhirl. It does start to fall off as you get farther and farther along, but it's still a very prominent, like, team member. I found Zubat, by the way. And this goes into Zubat, which gets a nice evolution in Crobat, except while it is a lot better than it was in Kanto, it still is in the problem area of not having a great stab option. Yes, it gets wing attack, I think, or does it get wing attack? It doesn't really matter. It has a lot of stats, which kind of brings it to like here, but its poison offerings don't exist. And while you can do some whack shit with breeding, it's not that good of a Pokemon in general, which goes into Paris. We talked about this last time, how Paris is very, very not usable. But it's changed a bit because the move pools have changed a lot, and it just actually gets even worse. It gets even worse. I think it's probably one of the worst bugs. I think Spinarak beats it. But again, bug grass is just terrible. It's just terrible. It doesn't really fit into any department of being usable, which is really, really frustrating. And at the same time, it just doesn't, like, it doesn't get any new shit. It's still just the Spore Machine, which cool. Bellsprout. Bellsprout, again, is very interesting because one of the biggest problems with Victory Bell in the past is access to stab poison moves. I think it gets acid in yellow or something. Or maybe that's later, or maybe I'm thinking of something completely different. But now you have access to Sludge Bomb, which I don't even know if it learns. I think it does. It has to, right? Don't tell me. In my mind, I picture it with Sludge Bomb, so I think it has to. It just happens to be a better grass type than Chikorita. And as we'll talk about, grass types get brutalized in this generation. There's nothing interesting about them. Like, what am I doing here with grass types? They don't do anything, which is really, really sad. I do want to state that Leaf Stone is actually relatively hard to acquire, which means it's never going to really go above noticeable. And in fact, you could argue here, and it would be fair, but I do think you get access to the early grass move. And while you are punished for using it because it's a grass type, I do think its poison typing is actually relatively interesting because the other grass poison types are locked in weird areas or just really bad. Example, Oddish. Oddish is worse. It does get access to Giga Train really late in your adventure, and Petal Dance is an option, but even its split evolution, which you do get access to, is not good. Blossom is just not that great of a Pokemon, and it's really disappointing because, as we'll talk about it later, or in another video, I do think it actually gets put way higher if we talk about Gen 4 and the changes that were made. But because of just everything around this, its stat spread not really working for Sludge Bomb, and just everything around it, it happens to just be replaceable by Bellsprout, which Bellsprout can barely hold the grass type together. So good on you. We'll talk about the other Pokemon. You can get Headbutt. Fortress just doesn't really get to use much. It's one of the better bugs because of the steel typing, but again, it doesn't get a great move pool. I do want to state that probably can go here, just because of the tankiness of it. Other headbutt mons go in Heracross. This Pokemon is just interesting. A lot of people like to say it's one of the best Pokemons. It doesn't Pokemon, but it doesn't really get a. It doesn't want to get a stab unless you're doing hidden power, which at that point you're doing something specific. And two, its move pool, while lacking, is just good enough to be good. Its attack stat and speed are massive, but it's not going to sell itself to me specifically. Is there any headbutt mons here? I'm looking. I don't see any. I don't know what this is split up to, by the way, and it pisses me off. Venonat you can get quite early. I happen to think that Venonat is a lot better in this game. Venomoth is really late for an evolution, but your move pool in general is a little more favorable to actually being relevant. It is a bug type without a bug move that's usable. So part of me wants to put it in replaceable, but I do think as a headbutt mon, it actually gets some use out of it. What else is available in headbutt? I'm trying to remember. I guess we could talk about Slowpoke. I actually, where is Sandshrew? Sandshrew, hello. Sandshrew appears in Union Cave, which is one of the later ground types, and I actually think it gets some interesting use. It's not as... It's kind of in the same boat as last time, where it just happens to be a good ground type without a ground move, but Mud Slap is available, and while I would love to say that is really sad, Mud Slap does decent, so there you go. It still gets access to Slash. It is very replaceable by a bunch of other ground types that we'll talk about, but there aren't that many ground type offerings, which is why it's kind of moved up a bit. Let me talk about... I'm just randomly seeing these, I'm just moving them. Like, going to Union Cave, Onyx is available, right? Which you won't get Steelix, sadly. But if I could find Onyx, that would be amazing. I don't see Onyx, but we have the Nidos, which we could talk about. And we do have Growlithe, which is another fire type that is available specifically in Crystal, but does appear in Gold and Silver, or Gold, or whatever. But it does appear, and I happen to think it does get a decent use. It does have this weird evolution problem, which in Gold and Silver, which is a problem, but it gets access to Flamethrower by level up. Interesting. And it can learn some really cool moves that kind of put it in a weird camp with like Dig, and it does get access to Bite. It's a good kind of mixed attacker, which is kind of weird. But being that Return is so prominent, I happen to think Growlithe, it does incredible, even just as a Growlithe. And once you get to the point where you can get Evolutionary Stones in Gold and Silver, it does actually fantastic. But that's... I could definitely see a lot of people would move this down to noticeable. In fact, part of me wants to. I think it's actually under Totodile. So, but let's talk about... I'm trying to find like certain Pokemon. I'm just not seeing them, which is really depressing. Jigglypuff you can get early in Crystal, which is, you know, interesting. Unlike last entry in the game, we have a huge problem where Jigglypuff doesn't really do the same thing. The reason Wigglytuff was super special was because of the early Moonstone, which, don't get me wrong, you can get in Gold, Silver, and Crystal just as early if you work at it, but it involves a lot of like preparing. And in that case, the other Moonstone the only Moonstone that you have access to at that point should probably go to the Nidos if you were to pick one. But it happens to be, again, a better Dunsparce in this case, to the point where I do think Wigglytuff does get a lot of use. Does have access to a shittier special pool, but hey, you have Ice Punch and Thunder Punch, and does it get Thunder Punch? It might be Ice and Fire. Random move pools. We'll talk about the Odd Egg in a specific case, but I'm going to be really honest. There's only like one Odd Egg that's interesting, but that'll be far, far away. Anyway, let's talk about the Nidos, because you can get these relatively early in Crystal and in Gold and Silver. But they actually have a lot more use than you would think. I think these are even better than they are in red and blue. They're not as dominant, don't get me wrong. Poison ground is not a good typing, but it does get a lot of usable TMs. Yes, we've lost Thunderbolt, and yes, we've lost Ice Beam, but we still have a very prominent just form of random TMs you could pick up. And in fact, I'd say they're probably here. They evolve into a ground typing, which I've already talked about is relatively rare to a certain extent, and the poison typing isn't as bad as it once was. It happens to be that these guys just kind of hold their ground a bit more, and ignoring the pun there, but they hold their ground in not being kind of wasted away, which is a very good thing. I'm also noticing this, sorry. But as we move on, I'm trying to find, you could get Quillfish relatively easy, and it is a poison water type. We'll talk about Tentacool, which you can actually get around the same time as this. Uh, it's very replaceable. It does decent, like its stat line is really good for when you get it, but there's an Tentacool is just better. Like that's kind of the bad option. And don't get me wrong, its attack stat is a lot better for, say, Sludge Bomb, but I don't even think it gets it in Generation 2, which is wild. We'll talk about Marrow eventually. We're getting to the point. Tentacool, I already talked about, but I just think it's straight up the better option than Quillfish. I do think it's just bad, though, because you're locked out of Bubble Beam for a long time. I do think it gets Acid as an actual attacking move in this generation, or it might be later. But it still just doesn't have a great matchup for a water type, which is really, really sad because water types are actually really good when done correctly. But ignoring that, we have Slowpoke, which is also around here. Surprisingly, I think Slowpoke is actually a very, very good Pokemon. One, it gets access to Headbutt, which kind of fits its physical slot, and it gets access to a water psychic move. Now, if you look at the gym order, by the time you get this, you are fighting the Bug Gym, which is really, really sad because it kind of bullies it. It's slow. It doesn't get a lot off. But then you're up against Whitney, which the biggest problem is Stomp Flinch, a big issue. Then you're up against Morty, who kind of shits on it because fast ghost moves hit hard, but you are a physical wall, so you can usually hit a decent amount of damage. But then once you're past that, you're in this not so amazing but not so terrible part where you're up against a fighting type gym, so Slowpoke is good. Steel type, which you think would be a problem, but it actually does great against Steelix, and in fact against Magnemite it's not a bad option. It's not good, but it's not a bad option. You're good against Price because you can hit on a side and resist the icy winds, and you're good against Claire, who kind of gets shat on by a Slowbro at that point. And then it just becomes better as you go along. It does good against Will, does good against Bruno, does good against Koga, does good against Karen to a certain degree, and it does good against Lance. It overall has a great matchup spread as you get farther and farther along. It does start to stutter a bit as you get to like Lieutenant Surge. I do think it doesn't do that great against Blue, and it does struggle a bit against Red, but it still has a decent matchup spread. And this is where this Pokemon actually starts to, I think, shine as you go along. I don't think it's one of the better water types, or not the best water type, but I do think it actually gets a lot more use than you would think. Its typing is just special, which I talked about Water Psychic being kind of a double stack in red and blue, but here it's a much more unique option. One, psychic types have been neutered. Psychic types are not as prominently strong. There's counters to them in the steel types and also in the dark types, which Karen is a huge problem for, though you can kind of get around that. And at the same time, it just has the bulk to kind of win. I think, honestly, Slowbro is a really, really powerful in-game option, and it fits a lot of roles. It's physically defensive, and I keep talking about this, and it just has a great usable option. If you're looking for a water type, I do recommend it. Psychic type, it kind of covers the same thing as others, but hey, that's the way it be. Next we go into, I think Phanpy you can get quite early. Gold, Silver you get locked out, but Crystal you get this. This is the same thing as Sandshrew. There's a little bit of a difference where I do think Donphan's the better Pokemon, but because Sandshrew is available in actual other entries, I think it's more relevant. Pure Ground just doesn't get a lot away with it. This appears too late, which sucks. This would have been an amazing Pokemon, in my opinion. I would have loved that. Next we go. I think I missed another early Pokemon. Or am I going north into Ekritiki? I'm going by route order, which is really hard to do on the fly. Because I'm dumb. But Teddiursa technically appears. Teddiursa's good. Actually, I think it's probably one of the better Pokemon. It sucks that for other entries it gets locked into being really late in the game. So it's probably going to be bottom of interesting. But it's just fast enough to outspeed most things that really matter. And even if it doesn't, it's still tanky enough. It has a decent move pool, return, of course. But it also gets access to the elemental punches, meaning it's not walled. Overall, Ursaring is just good. I'd probably play at bottom of interesting in this case. Are we still north? That means we're in Stantler territory, right? Stantler, which is when you would get Growlithe in Gold and Silver, or just Gold, whatever the version exclusives are. Nobody cares. Nobody cares about them. Most people are going to talk about Crystal anyway. Where the hell is... I saw Stantler, right? I forgot one. I also forgot Ditto. Where the hell is Ditto? And Drowsy. Holy crap. Let's talk about Drowsy specifically. Drowsy actually got neutered in this generation. It is supposed to be a decent mixed attacker, and it does okay the same way it did in Red and Blue, but its special attack is nothing to be amazed at. It's a good special tank, but it's just Hypnosis, the Psychic type move, and the Elemental Punches, which we'll talk about better users of that as we go, or just right next. And I do want to state that it does a little better than people would say. Hypno is not a strong Pokemon. In fact, it falls behind so fast. Here's Stantler. But when it comes down to it, I do think Hypno does okay. The problem, though, is that Abra doesn't care. Abra is one of the best Pokemon, and even if we ignore Alakazam's existence... Sorry, this bothers me. Abra is one of the best Pokemon you can just have. One, it's a special attacker in the world that special attackers kind of get neutered because of their early level. And you think, oh, I'm stuck until level 16 to be able to use this. Nope, just throw Ice Punch on it. There you go. You won. GG. Thunder Punch, cool. Fire Punch, there you go. And then Confusion, Kadabra just nukes the rest of the game. You eventually are just one of the strongest options. Just to give an idea of how broken Abra is for this case, you get it right after the second gym, or you can get it. It does okay against Whitney, which is really amazing considering how frailly weak it is on the physical side, but you're great against Morty, which is stupid as hell. You're great against Chuck, which is stupid as hell. You're great against Jasmine, which is stupid as hell. You're great against Price, which is stupid as hell. You could see how stupid this is, right? It's all because of the stupid elemental punches, which just make this just a dumpster fire of a broken Pokemon. Funnily enough, a lot of people consider Kadabra even stronger than Alakazam would be in-game for Red and Blue. In competitive wise, I could see the argument of Kadabra just being a better option. Then if we were to kind of throw it back, if you were like, okay, we're going to go into Gen 1 mechanics with the special being the same, but Kadabra has the new elemental punches, and Alakazam's just left with Psychic, being broken as it is. Kadabra probably wins that, right? Like, it's insane. Didn't talk about Magikarp. Gyarados actually got neutered quite a bit, and in fact, its move pool is really, really shit. It doesn't get access to Thunderbolt, as it once did, because Thunderbolt's locked to late game or non-existence. It does get access to a few interesting things, such as Return, but that's legit it. As a water type, it's definitely like here. In fact, I think it's probably worse than Chikorita, which I have been brutal to. I realized that Chikorita is really low. It's not that bad, but it's definitely bad. Which goes into Goldeen, can also be found pretty early. Goldeen gets even less use. Yes, Return is much more prominent, and it does get a better move pool early on, but it's a water type filled with good water types. So there you go. Horsey cannot be found right here. We'll talk about it. Marrow technically can, but am I missing something? I guess we'll go a little bit into this. Machamp is not available, and Machop does not get the use it once did. Karate Chop is, of course, a pretty prominent move, but insta-crits are gone. As a fighting type, it gets really overshadowed by just how bad the fighting type is. Whereas fighting type or poison types in Generation 2 kind of got off the ground a lot easier. Fighting types still got left in the dust. It just happens to be that you have one option and one option only, and Machop is definitely not it. It's noticeable because it does hit pretty hard. You can get a decent trade for Whitney, so it is okay, but it's just not going to win any awards. I do think it's a good option, Machoke is, but it's definitely not like special in any regard. I totally forgot about Stantler. I think Stantler is actually really neat. It's just interesting. Has access to just weird moves. Shadow Ball return covers everything basically besides a few things. Does get access to Earthquake. We'll talk about it in later generations where I actually think it gets better. But Stantler is a really interesting Pokemon. We'll talk about Marrow while we're here. Again, it's the water type problem. I do think it gets access to Ice Punch, so it's at least here. It's a little bit of a health sponge for a Azumarill, and it's early, so technically it could be here. If someone were to argue me to replaceable from this, I could see it, but I'll put it there for right now. Next we go... Oh, I didn't talk about Apom. Apom you could get from Headbutt Trees. And I think that's legit all I'm going to say about it. It's not interesting. What are we at? What would be available? I think Farfetch'd is what we were going to talk about next in my rough order of estimation. Farfetch'd you can actually get in the wild this way, which we'll talk about Tauros and Meltank as well. And for a flying type, it actually gets a pretty decent improvement. Swords Dance is still in this level pool, and it gets access to Return, which it does decent. It just does a little better than it once did. I do think it isn't great, but it's definitely a lot higher, which you can see the normal types are getting a big boost. I said bust, which is, I mean, they could be busty, but we don't know. Whitney, or Meltank, sorry, slipped there. Meltank's just one of the best, and where's Tauros at? Tauros is a little worse. Alright, please, where's Waldo? Where's Waldo? Tauros. I don't see this shit. Technically, we should talk about these legendaries too. But, you gotta be kidding me. Is it just me? Am I missing, like, Tauros specifically? There's Kangaskhan. Oh, here's Tauros. We are actually gonna move these to here. They have a really interesting mindset. Actually, I'm gonna throw this along with Heracross. So Tauros doesn't get that many great options. Meltank, on the other hand, is one of the best normal types in the game, and the reasoning of the difference is, one, Meltank fits its name being a tank, and also gets access to Fire Punch, which means it doesn't get walled. Tauros is different. It gets walled pretty hard, and while it is a better attacker and faster to a certain extent, it just doesn't have the recovery, doesn't have the tankiness, and doesn't fit a lot more molds. Whereas if you go back to my older videos and you watch my Crystal Let's Play, which, my god, that was forever ago, I used Meltank to great effect. It was one of my favorite mons. It started to miss out towards the end in damage, but I mean, it's such a strong Pokemon. It can tank anything, it can throw out decent damage, and it's a great just pivot tool, which is not prominent in this squad. Also, I missed Ditto again. Funnily enough, this is actually usable. It's just really hard to use. This is not usable, is going to be very rarely put with other Pokemon, because it's not like Ditto, where Ditto comes super late and the other options it's up against actually hurt it. Ditto is actually usable against Whitney, in my opinion. It can be used against Whitney to actually use the Meltank and maybe get some rollout combos going. It can be used up against Morty, specifically against the Gengar, which is something to be proud about, because usually your Ditto is slower. So you actually end up in this thing where it can't really hit you. It does some weird thing. I think it'll try and use Hypnosis, and you could try and transform and then maybe do Shadow Ball. It actually does decent against bosses, which is really stupid, but it takes a setup turn, which is why it's here. I do think it's interesting in Gold and Silver and Crystal, which is way more than what it was in Red and Blue, which also goes into... Now, this is not usable. The sketch is just problematic. Unless you're glitching, it's not really doing much. What was I doing? Oh, we didn't talk about Snubble. We didn't talk about a lot of Pokemon, but Grand Bull actually gets pretty high up here. I actually think it gets right here. I think it's a little worse than Tauros because while it does appear earlier and you can use it, it's level up move pool, and while it does get access to like a decent like TM compatibility, it's just too slow. Grand Bull is too slow in comparison and it gets punished really hard. It's like Slowbro without the typing bonuses. Yes, return hits incredibly hard, but it's still a problem. Uh, Voltorb, I think, technically appears around here. Oh, we didn't talk about this. This actually got really bad. I do think it's noticeable as being a grass psychic type, but again, grass types get brutalized. Its level up move pool wasn't really expanded upon to a great extent, and it's just not good. We also skipped Coughing, which I think is actually a very good Pokemon. Sludge Bomb is one of the reasons this actually stands out, and at the same time, it does get access to really weird TMs that I think kind of bring it into a special quality. We're gonna organize this a little bit as we get farther. That does become available. Scyther is available, and it's still a little bit of a problem child, being that no bug type move besides Fury Cutter, but it's fast, it hits hard, and honestly, that's all you kind of need. It's noticeable. Pinsir is also another one. It doesn't get a stab, and it's overshadowed by legit the other bug types. In fact, I'm probably going to put it here. It is noticeable for being what it is, but Heracross exists, which is kind of why Heracross is up here versus these. I do want to point out, because you won't get Scizor, but if you did, it would be a very interesting Pokemon. It'd be a lot better than Fortress in this department, which it's still already better just because it's a bug type that can do something. But yeah, for the lack of a better term, it does kind of get shafted to here. Sorry about that. And you really need a drink. We're at like 45 minutes, which I didn't expect to. I also kind of skipped Eevee here, but we'll get back to that. And I think we're at the part where we're going to get into really weird, like, Pokemon, I think. Oh, we forgot Magnemite. Magnemite and Magneton. Being one of the only steel types you can have access to without trades, it's also a good steel type. There's something to be said how it gets walled pretty much, and there's not a great matchup spread for it. So if you look at it properly, you can get this right after, or even before the 4th gym, which it actually does a decent job at. It does great against the 4th gym, does against the 5th, does not good against the 6th, kind of okay against the 7th, but it does amazing against the 8th, and that's because it actually has a decent physical attack. I happen to think that when it comes to Magneton, it's actually really good, and it just gets better as you go along. You, of course, have the Elite Four where it does stand out. It does great against Will. Bruno, it's kind of a troublesome spot, and it does good against Koga. It actually trashes Koga completely. And Karen is actually a very important one because this is before the changes that happened in Generation 6, so it actually trashes Karen, which is kind of a problem for a lot of these Pokemon. It does okay against Lance. It does kind of get trashed by some of them, but it does okay. And as you get farther along into this, I think it's one of the best answers to Red. One, it's not going to take any damage from Pikachu. Cool. It does great against Blastoise, so it is going to take neutral damage, more than likely being slower. And it does kind of trash Venusaur, which is really weird to think. And it does just good. That's the biggest thing I can state about Magneton. It's just, it does good, and being a steel type, and as I said earlier, being one of the few electric types, and actually now that I think of it, for Crystal, it's especially up here. I'm going to think about it as I go along, but I think we might move that up a lot. But let's actually talk about a few of the other Pokemon we have access to. I have skipped Psyduck. Psyduck can technically appear pretty early, and surprisingly, it is a lot better than it used to be. I complained about Psyduck into Golduck not being a good Pokemon because, one, it appeared at a time where it got flooded with water types. This is one where Psyduck actually feels very, very strong. It appears at a time in Crystal specifically where it can get access to Ice Punch and start throwing out some decent damage. It just happens to be it's weaker than most of the other water types. But for the most part, it does decent in its regard. It's kind of... It's if you want a psychic like confusion, it's okay. It's okay. There's a lot of problems with it, but eh, I like to give it some credit because it definitely had a glow up. Where are we at? I think Krabby is technically available, right? Or do you need the good rod? I think you need the good rod, which is Olivine. Is Shelter even available at this? I don't think it is. Sorry, I'm trying to remember if it's available. Mankey is a little bit ahead. We should probably just go in any order at this point because there's so many of these. Like, what the hell am I looking at? We should talk about the babies, I guess. All these babies suck. I guess. So if we're talking about the odd egg, I don't think this is usable. I guess Hitmonlee is okay. This is one of the better ones, and we'll talk about it. So in back in the day when I played Pokemon Crystal in the Let's Play, I actually ended up using one of these for I bred the Jinx so I could have access to Psychic because I wanted Psychic into Ice Beam, which it proved to be a pretty valuable mon. It just sucked to get there. So I do think it's very special, and in fact, I'd probably say noticeable, but it's not overall interesting. Elekid actually gets a very, by the way, it took me that long. I hope it wasn't that noticeable. I forgot Smoochum was the name, just stating. But Elekid actually gets to be here because, one, it's electric type, and that's basically it. And then we get access to another fire type, which is really, really cool. It doesn't, we'll organize these in a second as we get through the babies, but when it comes down to it, a lot of the babies just aren't interesting to me. Also sad that Clefairy gets knocked down here. They do get access to a Moonstone. But is it a good normal type? No, there's other normal types that are, yeah, replaceable. Even though I do love Clefable. That's way late in the game. I could have talked about Lapras. Igglybuff. You get access to Jigglypuff, so technically, I guess it's interesting, cool, whatever. I'm missing a couple other babies, aren't I? Oh, we didn't talk about Yanma. This is actually super mid. It's a swarm Pokemon. It's a bug type. Look at the bug type train, by the way. Just very sad. I actually think it's one of the worst bug types. It does nothing. What? I'm missing a few babies, aren't I? There's Clefairy, Clefable. I feel like I am, but I guess I'm not. Togepi was already up because you get it earlier. Alright. I guess I'm just dumb. Anyway, we're back here, I think. I totally like brain farted as we come up here. We still have so many Pokemon to talk about. This was a mistake. But I can't talk about. Wait, can we get Mr. Mime at this point? No, that's a little bit later. Oh my god, there's so many options. Horsey is technically available right around now, along with Krabby, I think. Without Kingdra is very replaceable. And in fact, even with Kingdra, which, let me go find that. It's blue, so you think it would be easy, but in fact, my eyes are not finding it. But without Kingdra, it's not that good. As somebody who actually used it in a full team in the Crystal Let's Play, hey, another one, another reference to it, it's not a fantastic option. It's just not. With Kingdra, it'd probably be noticeable. It's one of the tankier Pokemon, but it just doesn't hit hard enough. It's really sad because you think it would be good. Where are we on, man? There's so many. Look at all these Pokemon. Voltorb, you could... No, that's a little bit later. Chinchou, can you get Chinchou? It might be Super Rod only. I think it's Good Rod, actually. Lantern, I think, is actually pretty interesting. Water Electric covers both options at the Health Sponge. I also should have organized these. I think Elekid kind of gets to put right here. Magby, I think, is bottom. And I think Chinchou, if it's available... I swear it might be. I think is right here. I think it might not be. Also, these are unavailable. Why have I not thrown these? Also, I never talked about the dogs. The legendary dogs, or beasts, whatever you want to call them. So, they actually appear right after the 4th gym. Or before the fourth gym, so you can technically catch them right away, and they're super powerful. Uh, and funnily enough, when it comes to building a team, they are really, really special. So Suicune being the water type is actually like very good. I do think it kind of gets overshadowed by some of the other water types, specifically Quagsire, which has a very special option. And it doesn't get access to Ice Punch, which kind of brings it down to like not being that interesting. But then again, like it just does good as a water type, being its amazing stats. Raikou being one of the few electric types that doesn't get a great offering until Thunderbolt and Crystal. It's stuck with Spark and Thunder, so it's not fantastic. But again, of course, it is electric type, and it just takes a little too much time to potentially get. And it doesn't have a steel typing, but it's around here. And then we have Entei. It doesn't really get a good fire move, is kind of the problem with it. It's a good physical attacker, which is cool with return, but I straight up think Growlithe is a better option. Fire typing, by the time you can get it, isn't as good as it could have been. And it does okay, but it's just not going to be amazing. I guess we'll talk about the evolution specifically. By technicality, Flareon, Jolteon, and Vaporeon should not be talked about for Gold and Silver, but there are ways, and I just straight up will talk about them now because I do think it's important. One, Eevee, of course, is going to be all the way up here. It's just the way it is. It fits so many roles, and also it's one of the few, and by few, one of the only dark types you can get in Johto. So it straight up is one of the better options. This also goes into another thing. If you train the Eevee long enough, it gets access to Bite, which is important because then you have an Espeon with Psychic Dark coverage. It still gets walled by Steel, which is really annoying, but Espeon is still an amazing physical attacker. Also, at the same time, Umbreon is one of the tankiest Pokemon in creation. If you even train your Pokemon even a little bit, and you still fight Karen, you'll realize this Umbreon is hard to put down, which is why Eevee is probably up here. We're going to go on a reorganization for that eventually, but Eevee is insane. That's also not to mention that if you have access to Elemental Stones in, say, Crystal, you can get access to Flareon, which isn't good in this generation, sadly. Jolteon, which happens to be good in Crystal, specifically Thunderbolt, but Vaporeon is the standout. Being that water types kind of are in the same issue, Espeon is definitely up here. Umbreon, I happen to think, is super special. It's kind of with the same Meltank thing. Vaporeon being here. Flareon is definitely like replaceable as hell. And Jolteon's probably like right around here. It happens to be that Eevee just gets to skate on in for a free spot, which, yay. Sudowoodo, didn't talk about that. Sudowoodo is actually very interesting. Pure rock type, and it gets access to a decent like set of learn set. It just doesn't have a special stat to really be prominent. I happen to think it's probably one of the more interesting physical attackers. But access to Headbutt and Rock Throw don't make a great Pokemon. Definitely the Scyther issue. What else we got? I'm trying to see. Not to, we could technically get this, and we'll talk about Lapras as well, which we should have talked about with this. Xatu doesn't really get a great standing. As a Psychic type, it's easily overclassed by several other Psychic types on this list. It just doesn't get great options. And as a Flying type, there's other options that are better as well. Even Farfetch, I would argue. So it becomes very replaceable, which sucks. Xatu is one of my like sleeper hits for a really, really cool Pokemon, and it just happens to not get far. I think Lapras is the only one up here. Tangela is technically it as well. But Lapras gets to be just super special again. Like, it's so interesting to me that Lapras went from the last game being, like, okay as an option, being incredible for being water ice, and in this generation, it gets to do the same thing. Except I think it's actually better because there's not as many strong water types because Ice Punch is so prominent, but it doesn't need Ice Punch because it has Ice Beam. It gets access to Body Slam. Rest Talk is a thing. And overall, it's just an incredible, powerful Pokemon to pick up right after the 4th gym, by the way. You can get this right after the 4th gym. It trashes, and I do mean this legit, trashes Jasmine. You're faster than Magnemite. You hit with Surf and Kill. Goes and wins against Price, wins against Claire, wins against almost all the Kanto gyms besides Surge. Even then, I'd argue you could still just wreck it. So it also does amazing against Red, which is just such a stupid thing. Uh, but yeah, I think that is. Oh, Voltorb technically. I guess you could do some weird shit with Mahogany. Voltorb is actually relatively interesting. I do think it's a lot better than it used to be, but still just a problem in that it doesn't get a lot off the ground. Uh, yeah, it still just is the speedy Pokemon, which is actually a lot rarer in this game. Yes, we talked about Abra already, and like there are some fast Pokemon, but the super fast Pokemon like Aerodactyl, one, don't exist, and two, Jolteon is locked into a very weird spot, and a bunch of the other faster Pokemon introduced are just not there. So there's that. Girafarig was also available and we didn't talk about it. Normal Psychic. I actually really like this Pokemon. Hits pretty hard for what it is. It's kind of the same thing as Stantler, except I do think the normal Psychic type brings a lot to the table. It does bring a little bit of an issue as you get farther along because they both struggle to kill, which is why Stantler and Girafarig are next to each other. But I will put Teddiursa lower because I noticed that. Shuckle is technically available. This is unusable. It doesn't even get the full like trapping like thing. Yeah, you could do toxic stuff, but who cares? We didn't talk about Onyx. We put Steelix here, didn't talk about it. I do think Onyx actually gets a little bit better than it did in necessarily Red and Blue. One, you get the trade option right away, which is cool for a Bellsprout. If you trade a Bellsprout, you get an Onyx. And it can just trash Faulkner, but then it does good against Bugsy. It does good against Whitney. It does good against Morty, and while it starts to fall behind because its attack stat is really miserable, it just happens to do just enough to, I think, where it's replaceable, and it's probably better for you to go Graveler. But it's very hard to say it's just like super easy to replace because as a rock type, there's not that many that do amazing, so it's not a standout option. Next we go into Remoraid. I think is available in Gold and Silver, but I think it might be Super Rod, so this might be wrong. I think it definitely is Super Rod, so I think it's not usable, which really sucks. But I'm going to put it up because Octillery is one of my favorite Pokemon I never get to use. Very depressing. It happens to be a water type that doesn't get access to Elemental Punches. So, because it's so late in the game, it's technically usable, but hey, Octillery, why can't I use you? You could be with Quillfish. You know, now that I realize it's kind of unfair, it should probably be bottom of a replaceable. It's so late. Houndour, I love how I skipped a bunch of Pokemon, huh? Yeah, we're gonna do that. Houndour is, funnily enough, it appears in Kanto only, which we'll talk about Slugma as well in Murkrow. But the problem here is that Houndour is actually a really good Pokemon. If you go out of your way to get to where this is available, I think you only need one gym to get here. Or, well, I mean, you could kind of speed through. So I guess you could get here and have a fire dark type pretty early, but you level it all the way up, and what are you up against in? So you're good against you're bad against Brock, Misty. Surge is faster and it's neutral exchanges besides like Magneton, which I don't think it has. He has one. It does okay against Sabrina. It does good against Erica. Good against Sabrina. Great against Sabrina. Good against Erica. Blaine kind of trashes it, funnily enough. And then Janine does not matter. So, and Blue does great against it. It doesn't do great against Red. I was thinking real hard on this, actually. So I think it's actually just replaceable. Except it's not. It's a Fire Dark type. So I think it's noticeable even this late in the game, which is amazing. Where's Slugma? Where the hell are you? Oh. This is almost not usable. It's technically relevant, but even Ditto has a better offering, which is so depressing. Corsola, didn't talk about you. This is a really bad Pokemon. As a water type, it gets neutered. As a rock type, I think it's actually okay. It's a shitty version of Wooper, is how I would always put it. Right here, yeah, that's fair. What else we got? Ponyta technically appears. Going massively out of order because at this point, like I just can't remember all these. Ponyta appears right after the 8th gym with Doduo, which we'll talk about. And fire types just get a nice little bonus, and I do think it does okay, but it doesn't have a great learn set, which means it's just replaceable. Uh, which goes in Doduo. At this point, you have missed 8 gyms, right? When you're getting a Doduo. Dodrio is okay against the Elite Four, and it kind of doesn't do great against the 8 gyms of Kanto, and it doesn't do fantastic against Red. So it kind of goes into replaceable as well. It's still a good option if you're looking for a last minute team member, but that's basically it. We skipped Seal, which is in Whirl Islands, I'm pretty sure. Again, last game, it was very, very bad. Icy Wind is available, Surf is available, so it kind of gets a little bit more prominent, but there's a better option in the form of Lapras in general. And while water types are not as good as they once were, merely because there's so many of them that don't do the correct things, I happen to think it's actually pretty good. I'd probably put it right here. Probably right there. Seal does okay. Dugong does okay as well. Diglett is super unusable. It's in Kanto and just doesn't have a good matchup. Alright, we're going to look at first forms now. Cubone! I really wish this could use... If you go out of your way to get a Thick Club, this is one of my favorite Pokemon to kind of get, like, really late game. You have to go to Rock Tunnel, which is super, super far out of your way. But I happen to really think this is a fun Pokemon to use. It's not good. It's with Slugma. It's definitely better than Slugma, but it's definitely just not good. Lickitung is technically available. It's a bad normal type, but normal types do get a bit of a bonus. But it also is pretty replaceable, funnily enough. If you look at it, we've talked about plenty of normal types as we go down. I almost said Eevee, even though that's not why it's there. You have Miltank. Fearow technically counts. You have Tauros. You have Ursaring. You have Stantler, Girafarig. Noctowl is not a great example. But there's other normal types in here that happen to do better than Lickitung. Where's Tangela? Tangela is actually interesting. It's one of the grass types that I do think was miserable in Red Blue. And it doesn't do much better. I don't think Staryu is actually available, right? Is it? Is Staryu available? It has to be like a late. I don't remember. It also kind of gets neutered in this generation anyway, because Water Psychic, it doesn't get access to Ice Punch, which means it relies on Blizzard or Ice Beam, whichever one. It doesn't get access to Psychic until super far into the game, which is way different than Red and Blue. You're locked with Thunder. It's honestly a pretty mid offering. It's still a fast attacker, but it's not the greatest Pokemon, which is really sad. Starmie's really good. Mr. Mime, I'm pretty sure you can get this, right? I really want to look up if you can get Mr. Mime, but we'll talk about Jinx specifically. So we talked about Smoochums earlier with the Odd Egg, which I happen to think is kind of up here. I think Jinx is actually very, very special. One, it's a Psychic type that appears really late. It doesn't get a Psychic type move, which is really sad until way later, but ignoring my movement, it gets access to Ice Punch and does decent in almost every other regard. So I happen to think it probably is noticeable. I realize I've kind of trashed on Totodile a bit, which was unintentional. I'd probably play it with Sudowoodo, honestly. It does pretty good. Pretty sure you don't get Electabuzz. You do get access to Magmar in Gold and Silver, right? And it happens to be probably one of the best Pokemon in existence. One, you get access to a very strong Pokemon early on, which is a Fire type, which I already talked about how Fire types kind of do really good, which is way different from Red and Blue. But I guess access to Thunder Punch, which will reorganize why that means a lot as we go along. I'm looking up Mr. Mime real quick. Gold. Pokemon Gold. Can this load up real quick? It's a nice little break for a second. Route 21. Isn't that is like, yeah, that's super late into Kanto. Yeah, it's where Tangela was last time. Tangela at least appears in the same route right before the Ice Cave or Icy Path. So Mr. Mime is technically usable. We'll say mid. Definitely better than It's just super late. Which, where's Snorlax? Same thing. It's usable, it's just super late. Like, it doesn't get to do a lot. Uh, what else is here, real quick? I'm trying to finish this up. Chansey is super late. It's actually super unusable in this gen. I don't remember where Kangaskhan is. I'm sorry. We should probably talk about Dratini. Because Dratini comes at a time, if you're in Crystal, this Pokemon's actually a lot better. But even in Gold Silver, I do think Dratini is actually a very interesting Pokemon. It's probably in the higher ups. Because Dragonair is still a decent Pokemon. And once he gets to Dragonite, he actually gets access to a lot of TMs that I think just kind of put it into a very good favor. And Extreme Speed in Crystal means it's definitely up here. It's definitely not super special, but being that's one of the only Dragon types you can have realistic access to, it's important. I think that's everything in this tier, or in this section. We're also going to move Unknown as we finish this. I'm just making sure. Quagsire, Murkrow, we didn't talk about that. Unlike Houndour, who has enough of a little bit to be noticeable and actually usable, Murkrow is just a shitty flying type and a shitty dark type. Like, it's better to go Umbreon. It's better to go Houndour. Just don't use it. Mischievous, which appears really late or really late or really late or really late. There's no other option. This actually is not usable. Unknown is just technically it's with Ditto. Technically, but it's even worse than Ditto. Wobbuffet, in this generation especially, it's technically below Ditto, which is depressing. Gligar, as a ground type, it does terrible. It doesn't get a ground move besides like Mud Slap, I think. And as a flying type, it does terrible. It's very replaceable. In fact, I'd probably put it here. It's probably bottom of the barrel. Sneasel, as a dark type, there's way better options. As an ice type, there's way better options. And in fact, this is one of the worst Pokemon that you can get. It's just... It also comes way late. In fact, I'd probably put it here, maybe. What else do we have? Ooh. Swinub and a Piloswine and a Mamoswine. Except Mamoswine doesn't exist, sadly. But Swinub does okay. It has a decent ground offering, decent ice offering. Being a ground type, it does get a little bit of bonus. I do want to give it some credit for that. And its ice type, it does okay. I don't think it's ever going to win any awards, but it's definitely better than a lot of these Pokemon. Anything? We have Delibird. This is a literal joke, and it's somehow still better than half these offerings. Hilarious. Mantine. As a water type, it's not bad. As a flying type, it's really miserable, but... I don't know. I'd probably give it some credit. Probably better than Meryl, I would say. Skarmory appears super late, and it's still somehow better than a lot of Pokemon. Gets access to a decent, like, subset of moves that just are barely enough to win, is how I would put it. Is in the tank category, but being a steel type, I'm going to put it with Fortress. Even though, like, I will give Fortress the credit for appearing earlier, but Skarmory kind of just does enough. We already talked about that. Porygon 2 is not available. This appears super late or in Celadon's casino. And it's usable. It's one of the better options, but it's kind of with Houndour where it takes a lot of work to do it. Oh, we have these legendaries. I think both of them kind of just go up here. Lugia less so. I think Lugia is always going to go there. They kind of appear too late to really matter, but Ho does have access to Sacred Fire. Whereas this kind of just, I mean, Surf, I mean, they do good. I'm going to put it at bottom of interesting. They actually do well. Ho is, where was this? Was this actually here? I have no idea. Also, this shouldn't be here. I'd give Stantler more than this. Pikachu is not available till late, but we already talked about Pichu, which is the better offering anyway. So if Pichu doesn't exist, I guess I should put Pikachu somewhere. It's one of the higher up Kantomons. what Vulpix we didn't talk about actually appears earlier enough to be used, but it got nerfed in the transition, so it's actually worse than Growlithe. Uh, Surprisingly, I think I'm just gonna put it like replaceable. I think a lot of other fire types, even though fire types are rare, are just a better option. I think we're pretty close to being done. Where's Meowth even appear? Mankey does exist. Uh, Mankey appears in gold only, maybe. Uh, and I do think it's actually a pretty prominent Pokemon. Primate does good. It does good. I actually would probably put it here. Fire types don't get a lot in this gen. What else do we have? Is that it? Oh, Shelter. Oh, and Grimer appears super late. Technically, it's usable. It's probably like right here. Shelter, I think, appears super late as well. It might appear earlier. I'm just forgetting. But it's also not that great. Like, if... I might just be misremembering it, but I'm pretty sure it's Kanto only. But Dugong is still a better option, in my opinion, and Lapras exists. So, it's not great. But I think that's every first stage on this list, which I realize is actually insane. This generation does a lot better at making stuff more noticeable for team building. I know I was kind of like very fast to the end. Oh, I forgot Krabby. I'm pretty sure you could get this with the good rod, which means it does appear earlier. And it does have a better physical offering than in the last game. But as a water type, it's very replaceable. And as a physical attacker, it's very replaceable. I'd probably put it like here. Yeah, I think that's fair. Alright, that's Krabby. Boop, 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 boop. Looking at a quick overview. Meowth, I don't even remember where you appear. There's other... Honestly, I'm pretty sure you don't appear in Kanto. But we'll put you here because there's so many other normal types that do better. Yeah, I think that's good. There's so many Pokemon here. I've probably missed stuff. Technically, we should be talking about these, but I already talked about Tyrogue. It's not a usable Pokemon, in my opinion. Kangaskhan is available. I think it's available. We'll put it here. It's like with Snorlax. I'd probably put it like right here. That's fine. Alright, is that it? First stages. Rhyhorn, we missed again. God damn it. You could get this kind of late and it's fine. But again, same problem as we talked about with Graveler. It just doesn't do enough. It doesn't have the amazing like TMs that were available. Rock Slide is locked really late, and Earthquake is locked in the final dungeon, which is where you're going to get it anyway. I do want to say it's noticeable. In fact, I'll probably do this. Sudowoodo is more interesting. Yeah, we'll do that. I think that's fine. Alright, are we done? I've been going through this so long. One of the longer videos. And it's gonna get longer as we go. I made a mistake. I don't see anymore. So if I missed anything, I'll highlight it and I don't know. I might pay attention. But we are going to change these final offerings. About the same super special. I think this is one more than there was last time. But way more interesting Pokemon. Though, if I were to be honest, noticeable. Basically until about like Sudowoodo, the rest would go down into replaceable. So it's actually a very huge replaceable tier. Which I don't know where that would put. It's a lot bigger of a mid. Mostly because Kanto Mons get locked out, really sadly. But there's also a lot of useless Mons. But we're going to organize. I happen to think Magmar is pretty high up. Same with this. Oh, man. I think Abra is always going to be here. I think Meltank is really high up. And I think Lapras is. I might put this up. Because this depends on evolutionary stones. I think it's just always like this. I think that's good. Technically, this could be rotated around, but I think it's fine as it sits. But for team building, I actually think this qualifies for most of the stuff. That's not to say you can't use a lot of the shit. I mean, if you go back to my Crystal Let's Play, again, another drop for that. No idea why I keep bringing it up. But I used some lesser Pokemon, basically. Wherever Skarmory's at, too. I used that. And I used a really weird core that I think, honestly, was really fun to use. Uh, I used Smoochum in a time where, like, Smoochum's just bad. It's not a good Pokemon, but I do think it's enjoyable. So yeah, this has been like an hour and a half. I think it is. My timer is off, so cool on me. But yeah, with that, I think that's about it. Technically, Celebi could be talked about, but hey, it's not available. Here you go. Have fun. But yeah, that's it. I think this is a overall decent list. A little more offerings than Red and Blue, but hey, you have 100 more Pokemon to work with. Though somehow a lot of them don't appear in Johto.